Gilbert Gottfried spent decades as a comedian who was impossible to ignore. His voice alone was a cultural event. Jeff Beck never stopped reinventing the guitar. Legends called him the guitarist's guitarist, a title earned, not given. Shelley Duvall brought something fragile and unforgettable to every frame she was in. Some performances simply don't age. Kirstie Alley was a star who kept finding new audiences. Funny, combative, and always exactly herself. Barbara Walters invented the celebrity interview as we know it. She sat across from presidents, dictators, and icons, and she made every single one of them nervous. Coolio put Compton on the global stage. Gangster's Paradise is still playing somewhere in the world right now. Picture Midtown Manhattan, 1988. The cameras are already rolling before Donald Trump walks into the room. That's not an accident. It never was. He materializes at a press conference for what he's calling the most luxurious residential tower in the history of New York City. And the reporters aren't skeptical so much as transfixed. The building, Trump Tower, already 5 years old at this point, looms behind him in every photograph taken that week. He doesn't need to point to it. He is it. The gold-plated lobby, the waterfall, the atrium, the name in block letters 6 feet tall. Before the internet, before reality television, before a single vote was cast with his name on the ballot, Donald John Trump had figured out something that most people in American life would not understand for another decade. That perception, aggressively managed, becomes its own form of reality. He was born in Queens, New York, on June 14th, 1946, the fourth of 5 children raised by Fred Trump, a Brooklyn real estate developer who built his fortune on middle-income housing in the outer boroughs, and Mary Ann MacLeod Trump, a Scottish immigrant from the Isle of Lewis. The Trumps were prosperous but not glamorous. Fred's world was practical, transactional, unglamorous. Rent rolls and building codes and union negotiations. But something in the youngest son, who paid attention to his father's work, was already looking past Queens, past Brooklyn, past the outer boroughs entirely. When Donald enrolled at Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and graduated in 1968 with a degree in economics, he returned not to follow his father's blueprint exactly, but to use it as a launch pad. His first major move in Manhattan wasn't Trump Tower. It was the Commodore Hotel on 42nd Street, a derelict ruin next to Grand Central Station that he managed to transform with a complex arrangement involving the city of New York, Hyatt hotels, and a 40-year tax abatement that his critics would still be arguing about decades later. He was 27 years old when the deal closed. The building reopened as the Grand Hyatt New York in 1980, and what it demonstrated wasn't just that Trump could close a complicated real estate deal, it was that he understood leverage in the civic sense, how to use public need, private capital, and personal audacity as a 3-part mechanism. That knowledge would never leave him. Trump Tower followed in 1983, 5th Avenue, 56th Street. And it wasn't just a building, it was a brand installation. The pink marble atrium, the retail floors, the residential area above. It drew celebrities, it drew tabloids, it drew tourists who had no interest in buying a condominium but simply wanted to stand in the lobby and feel adjacent to something. Trump understood that feeling, the aspiration to proximity, better than almost any American businessman of his era. He sold not just property, but a certain idea of arrival. And that idea required a face, which is why he went to the press, consistently, deliberately, across decades. He cultivated gossip columnists, Liz Smith, Cindy Adams, feeding them items, returning calls, making himself available in ways that Manhattan businessmen of equivalent stature simply did not. When he and his first wife, Ivana, split in 1990 in what became one of the most tabloid-saturated divorces in New York history, he didn't retreat. He narrated. He gave interviews. He responded. The story of his personal life became inseparable from the story of his business life, and both of them together became the story of a city and a particular moment. Excessive, aspirational, loud. That moment nearly swallowed him. By 1990, Trump's empire was in genuine crisis. The Taj Mahal Casino in Atlantic City, which he had christened the eighth wonder of the world, had opened carrying nearly $1 billion in debt. The Plaza Hotel, which he had bought from Westin in 1988 for $407 million, was hemorrhaging money. Trump Airlines, the shuttle service he had purchased from Eastern Airlines, was failing. The banks, Citibank, manufacturers Hanover, Bankers Trust, and others held collectively more than $3 billion in loans. There were serious, documented discussions about whether he would be forced into personal bankruptcy. He was not. What happened instead was a negotiation, grinding, humbling, reported on in forensic detail by journalists at the New York Times and elsewhere, in which Trump surrendered equity stakes, accepted personal spending limits, and restructured debt over years. His casinos did eventually go through multiple bankruptcy proceedings, as did some of his other entities. But Trump himself personally did not. He came back. Not quietly, not with chastened humility, but loudly, the way he had always operated. By the mid-1990s, he was writing again about his comeback in books that sold, giving speeches on success to audiences that paid to hear them, and quietly repositioning the Trump brand from real estate developer to something larger and harder to define, a symbol of American excess that had survived its own worst impulses. The intellectual architecture of that brand was sharpened considerably by a book he had published in 1987, before the crash, The Art of the Deal, written with journalist Tony Schwartz. It sold more than 1 million copies in its first year. It sat on the New York Times bestseller list for 51 weeks. The persona it constructed, aggressive, transactional, contemptuous of sentimentality, relentlessly confident, became the operating manual that millions of readers, particularly aspiring business people, internalized as gospel. Whatever Schwartz said later about the book's origins or his own discomfort with the project, the cultural impact of the text was real and vast. Trump had written his own mythology before most people had the faintest idea who he was outside of New York. The television chapter arrived fully formed in January 2004, when The Apprentice debuted on NBC. The premise: contestants competing for a job in the Trump organization, sounds thin on paper, but the execution, guided by producer Mark Burnett, made it something else entirely. The show became a genuine ratings phenomenon. The first season averaged more than 20 million viewers per episode. The boardroom scenes, the blunt eliminations, the two words that became a cultural touchstone. The show distilled something that American audiences apparently wanted badly: clarity, consequence, authority delivered without apology. Trump played himself, but a heightened, sharpened, maximally dramatic version of himself, and the country watched. The Apprentice ran for 14 seasons, including the Celebrity Apprentice spin-off, and it did something that no amount of real estate or tabloid coverage had quite accomplished. It made Trump a household presence in living rooms far from New York City. In rural America, in the South, in the Midwest, in places where no one had ever thought about the zoning regulations of Midtown Manhattan, people knew who Donald Trump was. They had watched him make decisions on television every week. That familiarity, parasocial, mediated, but emotionally real to the people who felt it, would prove to be among the most significant political assets any American candidate had ever assembled, even if no one recognized it as political at the time. He announced his candidacy for President of the United States on June 16, 2015, descending an escalator in Trump Tower with Melania at his side. The political establishment, in both parties, treated it as spectacle. Cable news covered it wall to wall, partly because it was genuinely unusual and partly because it was irresistible to watch. What followed was one of the most documented political campaigns in American history. Trump defeated 16 opponents in the Republican primary, operating outside every conventional rule of political conduct. He attacked journalists by name, feuded publicly with members of his own party, held arena rallies that felt more like performance events than traditional stump speeches, and dominated the media cycle in ways that political scientists are still trying to fully account for. On November 8, 2016, he defeated Hillary Clinton in the general election, carrying 306 electoral votes to her 232. It was one of the most consequential upsets in the history of American democracy, a result that almost no major polling organization had predicted, that shook the global political establishment, and that remains contested in its interpretation to this day. What it meant, what caused it, what it says about the country, those arguments are ongoing and enormous. What is indisputable is that it happened, and that it changed things. His presidency, from January 2017 to January 2021, was one of the most turbulent in modern American history. He passed a major tax reform package in December 2017. He renegotiated NAFTA into the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. He appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, reshaping the court's ideological composition for what could be a generation. He oversaw the normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab states known as the Abraham Accords. He was impeached twice by the House of Representatives, once in December 2019 on charges related to Ukraine, once in January 2021 following the events of January 6th at the United States Capitol, and acquitted by the Senate both times. No other American president has been impeached twice. The events of January 6, 2021, when a mob of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol as Congress was certifying the Electoral College results, remain among the most examined and debated events of his presidency. Congressional investigations, documentary filmmakers, journalists, and historians have produced enormous bodies of work attempting to establish what happened, who was responsible, and what it means for American democratic institutions. The legal and political consequences of that day are still unfolding. After leaving the White House, Trump returned to Mar-a-Lago, his Palm Beach estate, which he had purchased from the Post family in 1985 and converted from private club to what became effectively his operational headquarters. He remained dominant in Republican politics in a way that ex-presidents almost never do. He endorsed candidates in midterm elections, some won, some lost, but his influence over the party's direction was not seriously disputed. He launched a social media platform, Truth Social, in 2022. He announced a third presidential campaign in November 2022, earlier than any major candidate in recent history. In 2024, he won the Republican nomination for a second time. the first Republican since Dwight D. Eisenhower to win non-consecutive terms, and in November 2024, he won the presidential election against Democratic nominee Kamala Harris, becoming the 47th President of the United States. The victory made him only the second person in American history to serve non-consecutive presidential terms, joining Grover Cleveland in that distinction. The legal challenges surrounding him, federal indictments, state prosecutions, civil judgments, generated historic volumes of coverage and commentary. Whatever their ultimate outcomes, they have not, as of this writing, removed him from the center of American public life. He remains the most polarizing figure in contemporary American politics, a person about whom virtually no one feels nothing. That in itself is a form of power. The cultural footprint is harder to quantify, but no less real. He appears in hip-hop lyrics across 4 decades. He is referenced in television shows, films, novels, and works of visual art. His negotiating style, or at least the version of it codified in The Art of the Deal, became part of the vocabulary of American business culture. The word brand itself, in the modern sense of a personal identity deployed commercially and culturally, owes something to what Trump did before most people had language for it. What do you do with a figure this contradictory, this enormous, this unresolved? He is not a cautionary tale. His story hasn't ended in the way cautionary tales require. He is not a simple success narrative. The crashes, the bankruptcies, the 2 impeachments, the legal proceedings won't allow that. He is something genuinely unusual in American life. A person who built his celebrity before his political career, his mythology before his governing record, his brand before either, and who has now outlasted the predictions repeated of his own irrelevance. The gold letters are still on the building. The building is still on Fifth Avenue, and the man whose name they spell is still unmistakably